Okay, so this week we are looking at chapter 7, which is thinking and intelligence. Really what we're looking at in this chapter is cognitive psychology. So we'll start by discussing cognition and what we mean by that and how it's related to thinking. As you will discover, there are 3 ways that we can mentally represent information, or 3 ways that we can think, and that is through mental images, concepts, and language. So in this video, that's what we'll be doing, I'll be giving a brief overview of those. We will then look at problem solving and decision making. So we'll look at various strategies we can use and also the various biases that we engage in and the errors that we make when engaging in these tasks. And then the last part is intelligence, including how we define that, the different theories that exist, and how we measure intelligence. So, as I just mentioned, what we're looking at in this chapter is cognitive psychology. So that's the field of psychology that looks at how and why we think the way that we do. How do we acquire the knowledge that forms the basis of our thoughts? How do we store and organize that knowledge? How do we use that knowledge? So when we're talking about cognition in general, this is an umbrella term for all of the various mental activity or general mental processes that are associated with obtaining, converting, or storing and using knowledge. So most simply put, it's just the term for general mental processes or general mental operations. And that includes things like perception, knowledge, problem solving, judgment, language, memory, intelligence, creativity, anything that allows us to acquire knowledge. So perception, perceiving the world, collecting information from the outside world is allowing us to acquire information. Memory is allowing us to store it. Language and intelligence is allowing us to use it, and creativity is allowing us to use it. So anything involved in those processes of acquiring, storing, and using knowledge. Thinking is a part of cognition. It's something that falls under that umbrella term. They essentially come hand in hand. Sensations and information from the outside world is received by our brains. It's then filtered through our emotions and our past memories and experiences, and then it's processed to become thoughts. So one way that thinking can be defined is as the mental representation and the mental manipulation of information. So for example, when we perceive something or we create a memory, we don't consciously think about that. It's a cognitive process that occurs without any conscious effort. We are collecting and we are storing information without conscious effort. However, when we're engaging in tasks such as coming to a decision, reaching a solution, forming a belief, solving some kind of problem, to do any of those kind of things, we need to consciously think about it. We need to consciously manipulate information, mentally manipulate information. So anything that involves that conscious manipulation of information is called thinking. Which raises the question, how is information mentally represented? There are 3 main ways that information is mentally represented that we're going to discuss. Those are images, words, and concepts. Okay. So mental imagery a mental image is a mental picture or representation of an object or event. So if I ask you to think of a cat, assuming you've all seen a cat before and know what it looks like, chances are an image of a cat will most likely come to mind. That image that you're holding is a mental image. Now, we use mental images for a lot of things. If I asked you to describe your bedroom, you would first most likely imagine sorry, one second, my dogs are having a fight right now. Hey. Okay. Sorry, I lost my place. So if I asked you to describe your bedroom, you would first form an image of it in your mind. Before being able to describe that in detail. Or if I asked you to explain what a wedding looked like, even if you'd never been to one, you might not be picturing a specific wedding from memory, but you would probably form images based on your knowledge or ideas of weddings. So a mental image doesn't actually need to be from memory. It can be something that you've created in your imagination. The point is there's some kind of mental picture or image that you're holding in your mind. Now, creating a mental image and actually seeing something do use very similar parts of the brain, but one of the big differences between the two is that a mental image can be manipulated. So one way that this can be done is through mental rotation. Now, normally at this point, I'd have you look at these 3 pairs of shapes, and I'd ask you whether they were the same or different. And basically that would require you to mentally rotate the shapes in order to get to the answers. So I'm not going to give you the answers. I'll let you maybe pause after the video or go back to this and have a go at mentally rotating these shapes to figure out if they're the same or different. Now, as I already mentioned, being able to form mental images helps us with a lot. In particular, being able to manipulate mental images helps us perform a lot of different cognitive tasks. So for example, following directions or solving a problem. Let's say you're trying to remember how to get to the gas station. You could remember that you need to make 2 lefts and a right, and that would work. But it would be a lot easier if you just need to remember that, oh, when I get to 7-Eleven, I turn left here, and then when I get to Bonds, I turn right, and then right again at Ralph's. It's much easier to remember in imagery, usually, than in words. Or let's say you've bought a new piece of furniture for your bedroom, and you need to figure out where it's going to fit. So you have a problem to solve. Now, one way of solving that would be trial and error. You go around and you put it in different positions and try to figure out how it works. But that's going to take time and a lot of work. Instead, what you're most likely going to do is mentally picture it in your head and rotate it in your head in different locations in your room until you get to a point where you're like, I think it's going to work here. There's still going to be some level of trial and error. You're still going to have to test it out, but it saves you a lot of time and energy being able to mentally rotate that piece of furniture in your head and imagine it in different locations in your room before actually trying to move it. Now, mental imagery is not actually just limited to visual images, although most of these examples have been. We can imagine other senses. So we can imagine what something tastes like. We can remember what something sounds like. If I ask you to think of a certain song right now, you would be able to imagine that song in your head. If I asked you to imagine your favorite song, there would be some form of auditory imagery in your mind for what that song sounds like. However, not everything can be represented by mental imagery. For example, if I ask you to think about the word courage, you might think of images of things you associate with courage, but you probably don't have an image for the word courage itself. So instead, we use words or concepts. So concepts are categories for classifying events, objects, or ideas based on their common features. So basically ways of categorizing information that belong together, that share certain features. So for example, take the concept of a car. There are lots of different types of cars, but they all share common features, which causes us to classify them as one category, which we call cars. And as a result of that, because we categorize cars in that way, if I ask you to describe a Toyota Camry to me, now you might have one, you might know someone that has one, you might know enough about that car to tell me about that car, but the point is even if you've never seen a Toyota Camry, the fact that you know it's a car, you should be able to describe to some extent what that would look like or how that car would behave based on your pre-existing knowledge of cars, okay? So basically what concepts are allowing us to do is to see relationships among different aspects of our experience, and it then helps us to organize that information. So a Toyota Camry can be organized with the pre-existing information we have about other cars. And then that helps to bring this sense of order and predictability to the world. So to give you another example, let's say you see a type of bird that you've never seen before. The fact that you can categorize it as a bird because it shares certain features with other birds that you've seen allows you to then infer certain characteristics about it and predict aspects of its behavior. You know that it's probably going to be able to fly. I mean, not necessarily, not all birds can, but you have a generally good idea that even though I've never seen this bird before, it's probably going to be able to fly because that's what most birds do. In certain situations, this can be very, very beneficial for survival. It's kind of a shortcut way of predicting how something's going to behave and how we need to react. So if you were to see something slithering along the floor in the woods, you can probably say, well, that's a snake, and you'll then know how you should respond. It may not be a dangerous snake, it may be completely fine, but at least if you're not sure of exactly what type of snake it is, you still have an idea of how it will behave and how you need to behave in response to that, and that can then obviously protect you. Now, concepts can be categorized in two ways, as concrete or abstract. So a concrete concept is something that's tangible. It includes tangible objects and things that we can objectively or factually describe. So, for example, here we've got animals, furniture, cars. These are tangible things. They are things that if I asked you to describe them, you're all probably going to describe them in similar ways because they're objective. If I asked you to describe a chair, of course, imagery-wise, you might all think of different types of chairs, but in terms of actually describing the basic features of a chair, that's a very objective thing. On the other hand, things like love, justice, courage, these are abstract concepts. They're not tangible and they're not objective. If I was to ask you to describe any of these terms, you're all going to do it in a very different way. We do have a general understanding of what these terms mean and how to use them, but the way we would actually define them is going to vary because there's not one objective definition for what love means or for what courage means or for what justice means. That's somewhat subjective. Now, if I was to ask you to think of a dog, you'd probably notice that a specific type of dog comes to mind. So that might be a specific breed. So for a lot of people, it would be a Labrador, a Golden Retriever, a German Shepherd, kind of these obvious examples. Or it might be a dog that you know, the dog that you own. The example that comes to mind, whatever is your best example for that concept, that is called a prototype. So, as I mentioned, the obvious ones, the obvious prototypes for a dog is a German Shepherd, a Lab, or a Golden Retriever. If I was to ask you the prototype for a fruit, or what is the fruit that most obviously represents all fruits, essentially, most of you would say an apple. It's the most obvious fruit that comes to mind. That doesn't mean it's your favorite. That doesn't mean everyone likes it. It doesn't mean that every single person thinks apple when I ask for the best example of a fruit, but it is probably the most common response that you would get. It's the best example of a fruit that most people would think of. So when we're using the term prototype, that's what we mean. So as another example, if I said, let's describe a prototypical college student, you would most likely think of someone, in their late kind of 18, 19 age range, early 20s. You might think of kind of someone in the traditional college culture. Maybe you think of someone that's in a fraternity or sorority, usually carries a backpack around with lots of books, spends their evenings studying. Whatever you think best represents a college student would be the prototype of a college student. Okay. So then the last way that we can mentally represent information is language. So just thinking in words. We're not talking about whether you speak English, Spanish, French right now. When we're talking about language, we mean a communication system that involves using words and various systematic rules to organize those words in order to transmit information from one individual to another. So this communication system that we have, regardless of what language you're using, we all have this system for transmitting information from one person to another. So we're going to break down these different elements that make up our ability to communicate with other people. What determines the meaning that we are portraying, what is determining the meaning that we take out of what someone says to us. So the first component is phonemes. So these are basic sound units like R, S, T. Now, in the English language, we actually have about 40 phonemes, and we use those to make up the many, many words that we have. So, for example, the word dog, that is made up of 3 phonemes, and they are d, o, g. Now, I haven't spelt this wrong. I'm doing this on purpose. If I was to be writing out the phonemes for dog using an English accent, so in my accent, it would be d, o, g with an O, because we do pronounce it as an O. But in the American accent, and please excuse my terrible attempt at doing this with your accent, in the American accent, it would be dog, dog. It's an sound. So it's we're breaking it down into the basic sounds that we use to make that word. Morphemes are then the smallest units of language that convey some type of meaning. So when phonemes are combined, they then create morphemes, or sometimes they're just one phoneme carries meaning. So for example, you've got words such as car, ball, they are morphemes. They are one unit of language that has meaning. We know what a car is, we know what a ball is. But morphemes can also be linguistic units, so things like prefixes and suffixes. So for example, usually means not. So the word unclear would mean it's not clear. Ed usually is what tells us that something is in the past, so it changes the meaning of the word. Pre is usually telling us that something happened before. So let's take the word pre-tested. That would have 3 morphemes, pre-tested. Each unit here adds meaning, conveys some level of meaning. Okay. So phonemes and morphemes are what make up the actual words that we use, but language itself, this communication system itself, is then constructed through semantics and syntax. So syntax is referring to the way words are organized into sentences. So for example, if I say buy milk that sounds odd. Even though the words themselves are words within the English language, it sounds odd because it doesn't follow the rules of English syntax. What I'm actually trying to say is I buy milk, but because it's not following the correct order and the correct syntax, it sounds weird. However, even if the correct syntax is used, a sentence still might not have meaning. So the example we have here, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. The syntax is correct. The actual order of the words makes sense, but the semantics are wrong. So semantics is referring to the meaning of words. If something's colorless, it can't also be green. As far as we know, ideas don't have specific colors. Ideas don't sleep, and I don't know how it's possible to sleep furiously. So the point here is that the meaning of the words doesn't make any sense. So it's not just enough for syntax to be correct. The semantics needs to be correct too. At the same time, with semantics, you could have the correct semantics. You could have the same semantics. Actually, let me start with this example. Here, sorry, losing my place. You could have the same word with different semantics. There we go, that's what I mean. The same word with different semantics, and that really can depend on the syntax. So here, don't trip going down the stairs versus have a nice trip. We're using the same word, trip. However, it has a different meaning in each sentence depending on how we've used it and the syntax being used. So the order of the words and the context of the sentence is telling us how we mean that word. In this second example that I was about to share, the semantics are the same, even though the syntax is different. So the dog bit the girl and the girl was bit by the dog. The actual meaning of the sentence here is exactly the same, but the syntax is different. We've used different syntax. So sometimes you can change the order of words and you can maintain the same meaning. At other times, syntax actually determines the meaning of those words. Before I mention pragmatics, there's something else that's not on here that I want to mention, which is grammar. So again, the rules for how we're communicating language, so in terms of using commas and other various forms of punctuation to add meaning to words. So if I said the sentence, some people enjoy cooking their dogs and their families. Okay, that's one way I can say it. I'm not pausing anywhere there. I'll say that again. Some people enjoy cooking their dogs and their families. That sentence has a very different meaning to the next one, which is exactly the same, but with grammar. Some people enjoy cooking their dogs and their families. So there I paused. The first way, without any pauses, that makes it sound like people enjoy cooking their dogs and they enjoy cooking their families, right? Some people enjoy cooking their dogs and their families. Whereas when I pause, it sounds like some people enjoy cooking, they also enjoy their dogs, and they enjoy their families. Okay, so where you pause or the grammar you use can dramatically change the meaning of the sentence, and it's important. The last element of language, which is extremely important, especially within psychology, the social pragmatics are the social rules that help organize language. Now, to some extent, that includes kind of the general norms and expectations for how we should organize language within our culture, for how we should communicate language. But it also includes things, expectations such as taking it in turns when you're having a conversation, what gestures to use and when to use them, how to address people according to their social status. So obviously this is very much dependent on a person's culture. The rules or the social rules that govern how we use language depend on the culture that you are using them in. And so, for example, different cultures have different ways of addressing people of various social statuses, or have different words for doing that. There's various expectations on the types of gestures that we should be using. And so all of that is considered pragmatics.